Welcome to the Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast. I'm Brandon Jaffe. Join us as we explore relationship and mental health issues by weeding out the trends in the mental health industry to uncover what truly works in improving our emotional well-being and relationships. At Inspired Resolutions Counseling, we specialize in providing interventions and resources for families with teens, focusing on topics such as teen mental health, parenting challenges, and family dynamics.
This episode is a recording of the Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens group. The voices of the participants have been edited out for confidentiality purposes.
A couple of sessions ago, we had some boundary talk, so I was curious to see if anybody made any headway or attempts to set boundaries. It's kind of the topic. Boundaries is one of many ways that we influence our children, but it's the one that parents like talking about the most, right? Why is that? I think it's probably a good place to start. We go through that list of ways that we influence our children, including boundaries and modeling and teaching them and loving on them unconditionally, providing resources, being happy. And the one that people always default to, the one they like talking about the most, even though it brings the most frustration, is boundaries. Why do you guys gravitate to that? I'd like to hear from a few of you. What is it about boundaries that make you want to talk about them all the time? Parents will talk about boundaries every single session. They'll give a glancing discussion to all the other ways that we influence our children. But when it comes to boundaries, they'll talk about it with me for months and months and months and months, and sometimes a few years. When there's so many ways that we influence our children, why do parents gravitate to boundary work the most? Let me try and kind of organize your words. Parents rely on boundaries or attempt to rely on boundaries the most because that's the most prolific struggle, is kids pushing the boundaries and parents trying to keep the boundaries. And you didn't say this, but that's the way that you can control the things that you need to control. Anybody else? For you, you don't think you have boundaries, you have conditions. It's kind of like punishment and reward. And I get that, but that's still the punishment reward talk, the boundary talk. That's where parents put most of their focus when they're figuring out how to influence or change the dynamics of the home. And my question is just simply why? Why do we go there the most and first? So when I have two parents come in saying, hey, my child's having a problem, we need help with the parenting, they instantly want to talk about boundaries. And they'll talk about, like I said, they'll talk about boundaries over and over and over and over again. They'll say, I tried to set it, I couldn't set it. We don't have boundaries, we have boundaries. They'll have that talk with me over and over again. But it's only one of a whole list of ways that we influence our children. It's not the one that influences them the most. And I think that's really important to hear me say. When I give you the list of ways that you influence your child, I didn't say boundaries is on the top. Get those straight and you'll be fine. Boundaries seemingly appears to be taking control over what you take control over, which in boundary setting, that piece of it is important. When I do work with parents, they figure out what they don't control more than they figure out what they do control. And so if I'm going to set boundaries in a healthy way, a part of that process is focusing on what I actually have control over and letting go of the things I don't have control over. Part of what you were also saying is when we think boundaries, we think change the person in front of me, which is really interesting because I'm telling you, hey, set boundaries to protect yourself. You're not going to change your person in front of you. When parents really get that, they stop obsessing over boundary setting. Again, it's important. It's just one of the ways that we influence our children. And I would argue that it's not the first on the list, not because it's not important, but because a lot of parents need to work on mindsets, attitudes, beliefs, habits before they can set healthy boundaries. For instance, if I'm stuck on punishment and reward and trying to control my child that way, my boundaries are irrelevant. They're just causing chaos anyways, unless I have a compliant child. The help world for parenting is really obsessed on punishment and reward, which I don't think is helping at all. And then they're calling a lot of things boundaries. And one of the first steps to boundaries is figuring out what you don't control, what isn't yours to control, or what you just simply by default cannot control. And then figuring out what you do control, which is a short list. But again, it isn't the greatest influence over your child. Influencing your child has to do with your demeanor, your attitude, your behaviors. It has to do with your daily routine, has to do with your expectations, it has to do with the resources that you offer. It has to do with, are you focusing on controlling things now, or are you focusing on the relationship? Can you love on your child even when you're rejected? I would say that your demeanor, the vibe in your home, your tone, the words that you use, whether or not you yell, I would say that the consistent relationship engagement has more influence over your child. What's that like to hear? That's a really good answer as to why parents have a hard time moving on from boundary setting while working on the other things. And so the mindset is, if I can just get these boundaries in place, I can focus on all the other things. Now, I'm going to change that up. I get that. And if that's the only way for you to get there, go for it. But I found that parents mostly take a really long time to figure out setting healthy boundaries. And if in the meantime you can work on things like not yelling, not participating in insane conversations, if you can work on the vibe in your home, work on your putting your marriage first, if you can work on really honing in on what do you control and what don't you control, if you can hone in on the self-care pillars, if you can work on all the other stuff while trying to figure out healthy boundaries, what happens is as those things fall into place, your attitude starts to change about boundaries. And I found that the biggest obstacle to boundary setting is not trying to change your child with them, not having that expectation that if you set this boundary, they will behave. Really sticking to, I am setting boundaries in order to protect myself, and it has a long-term influence over not just my child, but the people around me. Out of curiosity, what do you think is going to have a greater influence over your child? Them experiencing no yelling during times of conflict, or making sure that you have the perfect boundary for schoolwork? Didn't say you don't get to get angry. I saw this interesting little clip on social media about parenting and mental health, and it was saying that the most damaging thing you can do to your child is yell and get angry. I was kind of going with the clip, and then I realized, oh my gosh, I totally disagree with this clip, because they're saying yell and get angry. Your children need to experience you behaving a certain way while expressing your anger. You should get angry at your children sometimes. They need to know, learn, have modeled for them how to behave when you're not getting your way, when you can't control the things around you, when things are unfair, when things are unjust, and when you're scared for their future, your future. They need to experience healthy reactions to that. The damaging thing is the yelling, the name calling, etc. If you've ever seen a family where the yelling goes from being every day to non-existent, I will tell you there are more changes that happen in that family than setting 50 boundaries. And I will tell you that the boundaries end up being more influential, and the people who stop the yelling end up feeling like they had a long list of boundaries to set, to realizing, wow, I only have one or two boundaries to set. Any thoughts, you guys, on that? Yeah, healthy expressions of anger. Hey, say that you're angry. Ask for space. Communicate everything you need to communicate, but have a good tone. So anyways, I want us really thinking about all the ways that we influence our child and not always get bogged down with just boundary setting. I truly believe the boundary setting becomes easier as you work on the other areas. It becomes easier as you put in alignment God's self, marriage, then the parenting, right? The parenting hierarchy. It becomes easier when you're putting your 6 pillars in balance. It becomes easier when you're focused on who you want to be and how you want to act rather than focused on who you want to change and why. It becomes easier when you practice the 90-10 rule. And for those of you who have been with this group for a while now, you know that some people will come in and say, yeah, I stopped the yelling, then I put the 90-10 rule into effect, and then I was able to do the boundaries. All right? Does everybody know what the 90-10 rule is? 90-10 rule means that you only spend 10% of your interaction and engagement with your child on parenting stuff. School, teaching, reprimanding, boundary setting, and 90% of the time is spent on anything else that's surfacey. Now, the challenge for a lot of you parents comes in that you have been interacting with your child in just the parenting stuff for so long and for such a large amount of time that you don't even know how to interact with them another way. And they don't know how to interact with you another way. I had a parent a while back tell me, I tried to do the 90-10 rule, but I didn't know what to say or do when I was trying to do the 90%. And I'm sure some of you feel that way, right? I don't know what to do or say if I'm not doing the parenting things. And that gets in the way of me being able to get parents to do practice the 90-10 rule. Only 10% of your time. So if you only interact with them 100 minutes, only 10 of those minutes is spent doing the parenting stuff. How is school is a parenting thing, right? They don't really care about telling you how school is. Did you turn in your homework? That's a part of the parenting, right? If you have that conversation right when they get home from school, guess what? You might have just used up your 10% of parenting. Clean your room, do this, do that. That's all the parenting stuff. And I've had parents say, well, I used up my time. I'm like, well, that kind of sucks for you. But you see, if I get really good at the 90-10 rule, what happens is the boundary setting becomes kind of essential. If I'm holding myself to practice the 90-10 rule, I better have boundaries in place because I don't want to have to talk about the boundaries all the time because that's using up all my parenting time. I've had parents go, yeah, but you don't understand how bad my kids are and how difficult it is. I have to spend more time than that. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I do understand. Trust me. Now raise your hand if you've ever attempted at least to implement the 90-10 rule. What was it like to try to implement that? Okay, I want you guys to think about that, right? She's been working on this for a long time. She can't figure out how to talk to her daughter. And that's normal, you guys. They're literally a different, like huge generational differences. These aren't usually the people during this season of life that you would pick to be your friends, right? You're not going around befriending teenagers. But you see, it is our job and our responsibility to find that ability to connect with them even when they make it difficult. My daughter, she loves dragons and unicorns right now. I have no problem talking about silly dragons and unicorns for an hour with her. But sometimes we just sit. Some of you don't know how to just be quiet with your kids in the same room. It's awkward for you. Some of you don't know how to be quiet with anybody, with your partners. Really good exercise for couples is sit in silence and see if you're comfortable. And so that time with them might be spent in the car in silence. I don't know. It might be listening to their music. Man, I had this really cool experience over the weekend listening to music that I used to listen to. And there's some music and bands that my parents didn't want me listening to. And I did not become a murderer. I did not become a horrible person. I'm not in prison. And I think I turned out pretty well. I'm running this parenting group. I listened to some of the lyrics and you know, I can remember specific times that I listened to those songs, right? And I'll share it with you guys. I was listening to punk music on the way home from the river, like 90s punk music, everything from pop punk to hardcore punk. And this isn't stuff that parents back then wanted their kids listening to. But I'll tell you what, it formed these connections that were real and good. They made me feel good about certain really rough times. I can remember some of the hard times I had while listening to these songs. And I bring this up because a lot of times parents are very judgmental of music. We judge the heck out of the younger people's music. It's wrong, it's bad. Now, I know there's some crazy stuff out there, right? I know, like there's some stuff that you just got to say no to. I understand. But there's a lot of stuff that's a balance. You don't know what to talk about. You want to know more about your child? Sit with them as they pick the songs to listen to. Don't get icked out. I promise you, no child is in jail right now because their parent sat and listened to a song for 10 minutes with their child that the parent totally disagreed with and didn't like and thought was a bad influence. There's no research that says that. That's just one way that you don't have to think very hard to connect and engage with your child. What's that like to hear, you guys? I'm not going to disagree with you. But here's the thing. I judge you based on what you're going to do. And yes, some people start using the language that are in music. We see that happening generationally. What I'm saying is studies are not saying that that has the long-term effect that the 80s scientists and psychologists thought that it was going to have. I'm not saying like it, you guys. I'm not saying that music's the thing for you to connect with your child. I will never say go against your morals and beliefs, but I want you to ask yourself, what is it? Is it more important that I be a part of this so I can have a conversation during my parenting time with my child? Is me being open going to have a greater effect or me being closed? Now, sometimes you got to stick to your guns. I can't make that determination for parents. But it's one idea as to what you can do if you don't know how to talk to your child. There are things that you can find when you have an open mind. And music is one of those things that changes lives consistently, and it changes throughout your life consistently. What's another way to connect with our children when we don't know how to talk to them yet? This is another, like music, one of those areas that parents are afraid to connect with their children over, because everything in the media is saying YouTube, bad, social media, bad, video games, bad. And so I have parents coming in wanting me to assess whether or not their child's an addict, wanting me to get behind them in cutting it out of their lives. And right, I have many conversations every week about setting boundaries in terms of how much time with electronics. I rarely have a conversation with parents about how to connect with your children over something they're passionate about, even though you judge it. Now, here's a weird phenomenon that I have witnessed over the last 20-something years of practicing, helping families with teenagers. When you show an interest, the fear is usually I'm giving them permission to use this in a bad way, even though but they're already using it in a bad way. I can remember several years back, big issue with this family who they came to me with every diagnosis and conflict, and it was one of these cases where the parents had no hope. And one of the issues, one of the many, many issues, was that all of the children were playing too many video games, locking themselves in their room, etc. And then when they take it away, it's the crying and the hysterical temper tantrums. If you take the media, right, everybody's talking about that now. We're realizing that when somebody is like connected too long, they almost go through withdrawals. All that was happening. Remember, when I'm working with a family, I'm trying to reduce the conflict and chaos in the home. I'm not trying to fix every problem right now. I'm not trying to get all the moral standings in order right now. I'm trying to get a footing in healing the family. The dad started playing video games. And I didn't hear about the video game playing for quite some time. A whole bunch of things had happened. Many months, maybe even a year later, we start talking about it again. And it had kind of sort of self-corrected. There were still some problems with the media and the video game playing. And what had happened was the dad had kind of gotten into playing video games with the kids, and they were picking out video games. And there was this kind of just natural, when they were all done with the video games, they started putting it away. The kids still played sometimes on their own, but there was just this kind of natural cycle. By participating in the video game playing in a healthy way, the father connected with the kids, and that issue didn't go away, but that issue reduced. There are things that you're not going to participate in. But remember, we're talking about the 90-10 rule, which is spend 10% of your time doing the parenting stuff and 90% of your time connecting with your kids on the surface, mellow, chill, not deep, heavy ways. The biggest issue is parents don't know how to connect with their kids by the time they come to this group or come into our center to get help. You don't know what to talk about. Your kids don't really want to talk to you. You want to talk to your kids, but you want to talk about the stuff that you want to talk about, right? Then parents often say, well, I don't know what to talk about. I ask them about their friends, and they give me one-word answers. I ask them about this, and they don't want to talk about it, and they just want away from me. And so it is our job to find clever, unique, and good ways to engage and spend time with them. And sometimes it might be by participating in things that you're worried they are taking overboard or not doing well. The 90-10 rule, on the face of it, everybody goes, yeah, oh, I love that. And then when they try to implement it, they're like, but how do I implement it? I don't know what to do. Any other thoughts on how to engage with your child in a surfacey, fun, non-parental way? If you're going to connect with your child, there might be some really important vibes to change with you. If you're not attractive to be around, it's going to be a really hard rule to follow. And sometimes that takes a lot of work. Parents don't like to do that kind of work. This is really difficult for parents to hear. I've had several cases where the kids are like, I do not want to connect with my parent or parents. And when you kind of dig into the why and the what and what's going on, a lot of times there's certain behaviors that not only the kids notice, but other people notice too. Little habits, little tendencies that are not pleasing to experience that the parents just kind of dismiss. And it can be really uncomfortable to acknowledge that about yourself. And I've had several cases where the kids finally telling me, hey, look, my parents, yeah, they're doing better, but I still don't want to be around them. Well, nobody wants to be around them. They don't have friends. They don't have people that want to hang out with them because there's these things that I can't even tell them that they're doing because they get so defensive about it. I had a really, really difficult conversation with a parent the other day because they were having trouble getting their relationship pillar in alignment. They were having trouble connecting with their children. And it was one of the hardest conversations, but I had to reflect back to them that what they were describing were some social skills issues and some rigidity that doesn't work for anybody. And so sometimes you got to get your own social behaviors in alignment in order to even create the opportunity where you can practice the 90-10 rule. I've had several conversations over the years with parents who thought that being a rigid parent was the most important way to be, even though they experienced that and didn't like it. And then what happens is their rigidity was bleeding out into other areas of their life. And so they weren't connecting or in a good place with any of their relationships, but then they were blaming their kids for not having a good relationship with their kids. And again, that's a hard conversation to have with somebody, to reflect back to somebody who really wants to change that, hey, it doesn't sound like you're only struggling with your kids. It sounds like you might be struggling with others too, in terms of attracting people to want to be around you and talk to you. Oh man, that is a devastating conversation to have, but sometimes it's the most necessary conversation I've had with a parent who wants to turn things around. Any thoughts, you guys? See if I'm hearing you right. It sounds like things are so bad between you and your daughter that you're afraid to even talk around her because you're trying to turn things around. You want a relationship with her. You probably want to practice the 90-10 rule, but you find yourself saying things that trigger her, and you guys are in such a state that you could even say something that's not a big deal and it might trigger her. And so you're afraid to be around her. You're not alone in that. I know for a fact there are a handful of other people on this call right now who have experienced that. But you also said something interesting, and that's that you deal with business people all day long and you can communicate and do well with that. But then when you come home, you say whatever's on your mind. We live in this world right now where you'll see a message, say what's on your mind, right? And say what you want to say and need to say. And then over here, it'll say, don't say anything that offends people. As a parent, I'm gonna say, yeah, you should have the freedom to be blunt and say what's on your mind, but ask yourself why. Why am I saying that right now at this point in time? There's a difference between having discernment and patience in what you say, but not filtering yourself out of fear, out of needing to walk on eggshells. There's a difference between having that discernment and following every impulse you have to say what's on your mind because you're annoyed and you want to get the message across and you're trying to change your child. And so I think that there's a difference between parents who impulsively nag and say everything all the time because they feel out of control and they feel resentful and they don't like what their kids are doing, and parents who have discernment, say the things they need to say, but acknowledge that they can't just say everything that's on their mind, and then the parents who are just afraid and are walking on eggshells out of fear. I'd say the middle one is kind of where we want to be. You shouldn't be afraid to speak your mind in your own home. But you don't need to speak your mind the moment you have the thought. It's called discernment. Be patient. And you don't need to say the same thing that you had on your mind over and over and over again. If people heard what was in my mind all day long, I'd have no clients, no company. I would be really ostracized. And I would challenge you as a parent to be very patient. That's why I have the 90-10 rule, is so that you're patient and you wait to speak. Because a lot of times when you wait to speak, you find a better way to say it. And then other times you realize, oh, I don't need to say it. And sometimes it even changes. All those random impulsive thoughts I have throughout the day, they change. And those aren't the thoughts and the beliefs and the attitudes that I land on. I'm going to challenge you to never walk on eggshells, but have discernment and patience in speaking your mind. And if it floats away, it didn't need to be said. If you're patient and it resolves itself, it didn't need to be said. If you wait for the right time and you figure out a better way to say it only once, then that's a really good thing. Man, the seasons that I just say what's on my mind with the people I love in my life are not good seasons for me. I have those seasons still. But when we can find that discernment to wait, but never feel like we have to be silenced, that I think is the key. And again, I think the 90-10 rule can help us do that. Because if we're kind of going, okay, I have this thing to say, but I've only got 10% that I can say it. I need to figure out when and how in the quickest way possible. I think a lot might change. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Has anybody ever felt the need to say something really important to your child that was going to be a difficult conversation, and then you stopped yourself and you never said it? When you did that, do you think you changed the course of your child's life because you didn't say that one thing? I like this example. If I don't know what to say, it doesn't mean that I should say something right now. Now, sometimes you can say, hey, there's the topic I want to talk about. I'm going to need time to organize how to tell you this thing. But again, even with the big stuff, impulsively saying things just because it feels really big right now usually isn't the right answer. Are there any things that you didn't say that because you didn't say it, you've changed the course of her life for the worse, and she is now going to turn out worse because of it? I know you're concerned about her, but there's a difference between I'm concerned about subjects and me not saying it right now while I was thinking about it changed the course of my child's life. And it's really important for parents to understand. What are some of the things that parents really, really want to address right now? I really, really want to address that I just found the drugs in your room. I really, really need to address right now, while I'm not calm, the fact that you just flunked out. I really need to address all the chores and all the bad behavior not turning in your homework right now. I got to do it right now because I'm sick of this. And usually you feel compelled to do it because you're having an emotional reaction in that moment. My argument is most of the time, not all the time, but almost all of the time, it's better to have the discussion when you're not feeling that emotional tug, when you've sat with it for a moment, when you don't speak up and do the parenting thing during the crisis. You end up having more influence, oddly enough. Can you think of a time that you just stopped yourself, you didn't say the thing? When you have the hard conversations, only 10% of the time, in a less chaotic way, after you've had discernment, you are usually either more influential or you, at the very least, aren't as likely to create more chaos and argument in the home. There isn't usually that one time that you're so glad you capitalized on speaking what you're frustrated about because you changed their behavior, their mind, or you changed the course of their life. In fact, those conversations usually happen when you don't realize they're going to happen through the grace of God, just random crazy moments. What's wild is by the time they're a teenager, staying silent, staying patient, letting them stew with what they think you might be thinking is usually so much more influential than speaking up all the time. And again, this is another mindset that you can have so that you're able to follow the 90-10 rule. I'd love for somebody to please check in kind of just with where you're at. I want to hear tonight about you guys as parents. I love that you brought this issue up. Your child's older. She still lives with you. And she goes to the bars. You don't want her to go to the bars anyways. And she makes a bad decision. And you help her out. You keep your cool. If we're in the mindset of I'm going to teach her the lesson right now, and she's clearly going to learn from her mistakes, we're setting ourselves up for possible resentment. Wouldn't it be great if when teenagers or 20-something-year-olds get wasted, they never drink again, and they get on the straight and narrow, and they realize, wow, I don't want to go to bars anymore. But that's not how it works. I'm not saying give your child permission. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have boundaries regarding your home, your cars, the things that you actually control. But I like your story because you had the attitude of, hey, I'm going to go pick her up. I'm not leaving her in the street. And I'm not going to emotionally react to the crisis. And I am bummed that she didn't learn her lesson and went back. What I didn't hear you say is I flipped out on her because she went back. What I didn't hear you say is I ruined the relationship out of my need to control her bad decisions because I can't let her go down this path. I've heard life coaches, other therapists, read books, heard podcasts where people are giving parents this wisdom of stop this behavior at all costs, no matter what. In fact, I remember listening to a presentation once when I was beginning as a substance abuse therapist. This was before I even got my license as an LCSW. And in essence, the message was for the parents of this treatment center I was working at. And it was telling the parents, chase your child no matter what. Do whatever you can to get them out of the community, to get them away from the drugs and the alcohol when they're making these bad decisions. And it never sat right with me. And I think in theory it was really great. But at the end of the day, you can influence your child by how you live, what you model, what you teach, but you only have an 11% influence. You can set boundaries. Look, if you are going out and getting drunk, my money's not going to be spent on that. My car is not going to be used for that. But what I'm not going to do is ruin my relationship with you if you're my child while you're making those bad choices. I'm not going to tell you I'm cool with it, but I'm not going to ruin my relationship. The truth is you cannot stop your child from having this be a part of their journey. You can possibly influence them, but you can't stop them. And one night of getting wasted has not changed many people's lives and made them go, wow, I'm never going out to bars where you meet girls and guys and you get attention that you don't get elsewhere and you have fun that you don't, right? So what you don't understand is leading up to that getting wasted, there was a whole lot of good stuff in their mind that happened. There was connection before. There was attention from people during. There was the dopamine effect while they're drinking. There's all this good stuff. And yeah, it ended in being wasted. But then that teen or the 20-something-year-old says, well, I'm just going to do it better next time. But if you think that flipping out, yelling, and saying, don't ever call me again, for instance, is going to work, you're wrong. So I want you to think about that for a moment, though. In this story, yeah, she was able to patch things up. She wouldn't have been able to do that a year ago. She wouldn't have had the phone call from her daughter a year ago when things went awry. I'm not saying enable ever. What I'm saying is you walk alongside your children because you want to influence them, especially when they're being influenced by somebody else who's making bad decisions. You aren't going to be the one who stops them from making friends and making these choices, but you might be somebody who influences them over the long run. It's really hard for you to contend with these bars in Newport, trust me. But how cool would it be if your child calls you when knowing you're going to be unhappy with them? Knowing you'll never give them permission or say it's okay for them to do the thing that they're doing, but you're also not going to abandon them just out of principles because you're teaching them a lesson. What if when you do get into it, you're able to take accountability and say, hey, I don't like what you're doing, but I didn't like talking to you that way. Here's how I wish I would have approached you. And then because they believe you, they're able to take some accountability. What if even while you refuse to enable and say it's okay for them to live the life that they're living, you're also the safe parent that in the long run they are influenced by? I don't have to behave in a rigid way while maintaining my own morals and values. Now, you notice what I said, my own morals and values. I hate to break it to you, but your children often don't share your morals and values, especially during this season of their life. And sometimes your rigid insistence prevents you from walking alongside them with healthy boundaries and gets you into a position where you have zero influence over them. And what that looks like is you're not going to get me to join your morals and values that I don't agree with, but you're also not going to get me to enable them. But you're also not going to get me to behave in a way during the times that I'm getting frustrated that leads to me damaging my end of the relationship. You might not get my agreement, but you're also not going to stop receiving my loving on you. There's this really interesting and weird belief that parents hold. And that's that you need to make sure that your children know. It's most important that your children know what you agree with and don't agree with, and that they don't feel like you're saying things are okay. And so what that looks like is if they get an F or they drink too much, you must be angry, cold, and mean about it. Otherwise, they're going to think you're cool with it. That's not scientific, by the way. There is zero science that supports that theory. But isn't that a theory that most parents are living with? Any thoughts to that, you guys? The issue is when you engage with conversations with your child about what they should or should not do, or you maybe follow through with a boundary, they're acting surprised. They're doing that thing with, well, you knew I was doing that. How could you be angry? What? You have a problem with that? You're asking me, what do you say? What do I do with that? Isn't that me if I don't make sure that they know all the time what I'm not okay with? Aren't I giving them permission? My question to you is, aren't these all just insane conversations with her? If we do some of the healthy things that I'm teaching, like I'm not going to have insane conversations with you. I'm not going to have a conversation about whether or not I thought it was a good idea for you to go to Newport and get wasted. I know that you know that I don't want that, and I'm not going to play this game where you say, well, you knew. And no, I didn't know. I thought you were doing this. No, you knew, Mom. It's not just something that teens use in unhealthy relationships. I see this with couples. In fact, people will say that about employees who are doing the wrong thing and want to turn it around on their boss will do that. You knew what I was doing this whole time. And the boss is like, but we keep telling you not to do it, and you're an adult, so now you're fired. That's a classic human thing, right? Does anybody know what the term that is an example of a term that's really trendy? Gaslighting. I'm doing and saying the wrong thing, but I'm going to turn it around on you, and I'm going to try and convince you that you're actually the problem and that you're crazy so that you're flustered, and we get off the fact that I just did the wrong thing. If your child's gaslighting you, if your child's yelling at you, if your child's putting you down, if they're having a circular conversation or having a temper tantrum, they're trying to get you to explain something that you shouldn't have to explain, right? These are all examples of insane conversations. And you have a choice because you've been in my group now. You can set a boundary and say, I'm no longer going to participate in insane conversations. That's the whole boundary. It's not, I'm not going to participate in them and get mad and yell and convince the other person as to why I'm not participating in the conversation. It's just, hey, you know what? I have a boundary now. I don't participate in insane conversations. You choose to let them suck you in or not, right? And so for you, when you share this, I just couldn't stop imagining, wow, I bet you didn't want to have this conversation. I bet that you've had many conversations about what your child should do and what your child shouldn't do. You probably started to feel crazy at some point, like, oh my gosh, am I just not teaching my child? Some of you guys have this thought like, wait, is my child just not smart enough to understand and I'm being mean because I'm expecting them to understand things that maybe they don't understand? And then you get sucked into explaining, arguing, when it was really simple. Don't do this. And they started gaslighting you and they sucked you into an insane conversation. And so again, my response to your question is a question. Why are you participating in insane conversations? Can you imagine what you might do with the time that you'll save not participating in those conversations? So you stop engaging, you're not having insane conversations, and the problem is your children are turning it around on you, gaslighting you and saying, you're toxic, you won't have conversations now, there's something wrong with you. And then what do?
Yeah.
You either physically retreat or you get sucked back in, which means most likely 50% of the time you're getting sucked back in, which means their temper tantrum, they're engaging you when you try not to have insane conversations is working. You are not setting the boundary. You are not following through. Boundaries are not effective if you don't follow through consistently. You see, if the next 100 times when your children insist on you participating in an insane conversation and you just stay quiet or physically remove yourself, if you do that 100 times in a row, I can almost guarantee that that behavior will cease on their end. Not because they changed their attitude, not because they changed their mind, not because they became better kids who all of a sudden get it, simply because there's now a consistent pattern of that not working. Has anybody ever tried to talk to a wall for a significant amount of time on a daily basis? Can you imagine doing that, though? What do we call people who do that? Insane. I know you can't imagine this, but if you become that wall during insane conversations, eventually they're going to feel more insane by continuing to try to engage you, and it will most likely stop. Parents often have this need to get that really gratifying sensation and feeling when your child agrees with you and finally sees the wisdom of what you've been trying to teach them. You guys often put that as being more important than being healthy in relationship. You really want the feedback that they hear you. When am I telling you to wait for some of the feedback that the seeds you planted worked? 30. I don't want you worrying about that feedback until they're 30. It's so interesting to me when parents say, I keep trying not to have insane conversations, but here's the thing, Brandon, my kids are relentless. They said this and they said that, and they're following me around the house, and that's a sign that you continue to engage. Some parents think that they're not engaging. My favorite is when parents come to me and they say, I didn't engage at all. I kept telling them that I'm not having this conversation, and they kept going, Brandon. And I'm going, but you engaged. How did I engage? I told them that I wasn't going to participate. I'm going, but you were participating. No, I told them I wasn't participating, Brandon. No, I know, but you telling them that you weren't going to participate 10 times in a row was participating. I know, but they weren't getting it, Brandon. And therein lie the problem. You need them to get it for you to disengage from something that's unhealthy, yet you're the adult who's supposed to model healthy behavior even when they don't like it. And again, if it worked, what do you think I'd say to do? Keep doing it, but it doesn't work. I had a conversation with a pastor many years ago. He was really involved in, like youth group type stuff at the church that I was going to. And his stance was that the parents need to do whatever they can to get their children to church on Sunday and to the youth group. And he would tell parents of all kinds this. No matter what the arguments, it was just thump the word, get them there, doesn't matter. And I said, that's not working for most youth. That isn't the parents' role at this stage of the game. If the parents have done a good job, they have modeled healthy behavior in their faith. They've modeled happiness in their faith. They've taught the lessons. I said, this thing that you're saying to do is you are telling a bunch of parents to take control when over here you're saying this control is between God and these human beings. These aren't little children anymore. And he was having a really hard time because he was instigating or encouraging these parents to have insane conversations about faith on a weekly, sometimes daily basis, thinking that that was helping. But what he didn't understand that he was doing was he was telling a bunch of parents to do something that was not their role, not in the Bible, and wasn't helping grow this faith thing that he was trying to help people grow. He had become the teacher of rigidity, not self-discovery. And sometimes you got to ask yourself, is my influence over my child in the long run more important or less important than me seeing proof that I have made an influence now? A lot of times it is your own ego getting in the way. These parents and this pastor just really, really wanted them to come to the groups in the way that they had set up, in the way that they had fantasized about, rather than planting seeds and letting things grow. Now, some of these parents came to the first parent group that I ever ran. And then I had a kind of a discussion with this pastor about this over several weeks, and he stopped. And he changed his message. I did not tell him to change this message. He changed the message to tell the parents not to do anything. Don't force your kids to come to church or anything like that. Once the parents stopped forcing the kids and stopped nagging, what percentage of the kids do you think ended up leaving the church? 0. They came with their bad attitudes still. I don't know what their faith journey ended up being, but I can tell you this. The parents weren't actually as influential as they thought. They weren't the reason that their kids were coming or not coming. Nobody's life got changed because that message stopped being given to parents to nag and insist and to create chaos regarding church. I want you to think about this. How many people have you met in your life, whether it be with church or something else, have a bad taste in their mouth because there was constant chaos around that event or that institution or that thing in their life, even if it was a good thing? And so my point being, the nagging, the insane conversations, the anger, the chaos does not end up influencing your children. It doesn't influence them to follow the faith that you want them to follow. It doesn't influence them regarding drugs and alcohol. It doesn't influence them to hang out with the people that you want them to hang out with. You only have around 11% influence, and when you act chaotically and insanely in their mind, you lose that influence. And so the mindset tonight that I want you to take on is, how do I take on being more influential, not how do I continue to teach the lessons and get proof of my lessons today? Is that hard for anybody to hear? He just said, I'm worried not about what's happening now. I want my child to be a good person, to be successful, to do these things, when they're older. And usually parents add in there being happy. And so I think a better question is not how do I get my child to do what I want right now? It's how do I behave in a way that is influential, graceful, that protects the relationship while I have boundaries right now? Isn't it interesting that we spend more time on finding the right words to convince our children than we do focusing on the tone, the tenor, the volume, the attitude, the body language that we're carrying with us? I thank you for being here tonight, and I'll see you next week.
The Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast is an Inspired Resolutions production. Hosted by Brandon Jaffe. Edited and mixed by Natalie Atkinson. Music by Natalie and Sean Atkinson. Inspired Resolutions Counseling is based in Yorba Linda, California. Whether you're interested in joining our group, seeking therapy services, or exploring more of our resources, you can find us on our website, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at Inspired Resolutions Counseling.